Hi everyone, it's Morgan again, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about moving from analysis, which we've been working on in the previous unit, into argument, which is going to be our next unit. So when we're thinking about argument, we're going to be applying a lot of the skills that we used in analysis. For example, in order to argue about something, you have to provide pieces of evidence. You have to show your audience that you know what you're talking about and that you're able to piece things together in a cohesive way. So argument is taking analysis one step further in that regard, whereas with analysis for this past unit, we've been looking at things like different techniques of storytelling or the way that Hannah Atisha is fleshing out certain characters. Now we're going to be using that evidence that we found in analysis to make an argument about how we think we can interpret that text. An argument for what Hannah Atisha's motivation is, the kind of ideas or the themes that she's exploring profoundly and in new ways. All of these things are just building it a step further, and it's also centering your ideas as someone who has intimate knowledge of this text and as a scholar. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how we can get started writing an argument essay. So make sure whatever context you're introducing is something that's new, that's interesting, and that's also helping to strengthen your argument. Audience is all important when we're thinking about context. For this essay, your audience is going to be Kelly and me. So we've already read the book, we're really familiar with the book, so you don't want to focus too heavily on thinking about summarizing or over-contextualizing. However, if you are recounting a particular event from the book, you might want to include just a very quick half-sentence summary that says where in the story this takes place. If you're using some of those outside sources that we've linked in those prompts, then you might want to contextualize that source. Maybe it's a study conducted from 2005 to 2010. Include that kind of information. Maybe it's done by a particularly notable scientist. Include that information. But don't focus too much on context. We want to see your ideas in an argument. If you focus too much on context, unfortunately, a lot of times we run the risk of just summarizing the text for us, and again, we've already read it. So make sure whatever context you're introducing is something that's new, that's interesting, and that's also helping to strengthen your argument. The next thing to think about is how you're going to ultimately summarize your position. In an argumentative essay, you generally want your position or the claim that you're going to be making to be front and center. It gives your audience an idea of what you're going to be covering and the framework through which you're looking at a particular artifact. So usually this comes in the introduction. You can think of it kind of like your thesis, but it's going to be a little bit more direct. It's going to be you centering yourself and your ideas about the artifact, you really being a scholar. But as you're working through drafts, if it's easier for you to just go ahead and say, in this essay, I will argue that, I really encourage you to do that. You probably have some teachers who say that you can't do that and you can't write kind of that directly or straightforwardly in an academic paper, but as someone who reads a lot of academic papers, I'm here to tell you that people do that all the time. Of course, as you're working through drafts, think about more interesting ways to introduce your idea, more interesting sentence structures when we think about kind of like developing paragraphs from a couple weeks ago. But if that helps you just stay centered early on, just put it very bluntly like that. Whatever makes it easier for you to stay on topic, on task, and centralize your claim. Next, arguably the most important part of any argument is providing examples. In this way, skills that we've learned in analysis are going to be key to your argument paper. You're going to take little examples, little pieces of evidence, and slowly build an argument for interpretation. So for example, if I told you or made the claim that all blonde women were stupid, you would probably balk at that claim because I don't have any evidence to back that up. I, as a blonde woman, am actually really smart, so I'm already disproving my own claim. You've got to be able to have that evidence. And also, just as a note, that particular argument is bad too because it's a logical fallacy, it's a generalization, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about fallacies in a couple weeks, but think about those things too. Think about generalizations, really common claims that we make that overstate things that don't help us get to the specifics of an argument. So for the purposes of this video, let's say that I've decided to argue the following, and I'll just go ahead and read my claim for you. My claim is Hannah Atisha parallels her childhood stories about the corruption under Saddam Hussein in Iraq alongside the Flint water crisis in order to demonstrate that American democracy, despite its mythos of freedom and the pursuit of happiness, contains corruption that we often only associate with other, more authoritarian countries. That's a lot. And that is not what I am expecting your claims to look like as we work through the first couple sets of drafts. But again, for the purposes of this essay, I wanted to go ahead and give you something that feels complete, especially because I'm going to kind of demonstrate how I work in counter arguments here in just a moment. So if I'm thinking about some examples that I might include, let's think back to the prologue. The entire prologue is her talking about her family's life in Iraq, the regime of Saddam Hussein, their decision to move to America. There's a lot of evidence in there that can just completely flesh out her background and her family's story. We've also got a really great section in chapter 6 where she talks about the culture of old Iraq and how they're remaking it in their new American home. And another one that I might think about would be in chapter 13 where she talks about government officials who, quote, see evil and also do evil. And that's where she's really starting to kind of flesh out the history of Iraq, Saddam Hussein's regime, as well as things like bigger picture ideas, government corruption, untrustworthy politicians, things like that. Speaking of evidence, let's take a quick minute to think about rhetorical appeals. There's three major types of rhetorical appeals. Most of you have probably heard this before. The first one, of course, is ethos. And ethos appeals are appeals that are designed to demonstrate yourself as credible. As a scholar, as a writer, as a researcher, whatever situation you're in, it's you using evidence to present yourself as credible. A central aspect of ethos is thinking about counter-arguments. And of course, an argument, also another central aspect, is thinking about counter-arguments. And I'm actually going to talk about counter-arguments in just a minute. The next type is pathos. This is one you're probably also very familiar with. I think we've talked about it a little bit in class already, but it appeals to your readers or the audience's emotions. So it's using descriptive language or providing a particular story that kind of pulls at the heartstrings or makes you feel a particular way. Maybe it's designed to scare you, maybe it's designed to bring you joy. So it's thinking about those kind of human emotional reactions. And then the last one is logos. Logos is one that we normally think of in terms of just kind of statistical data or research, but logos is also the process of building an argument through inductive or deductive reasoning. So you're giving pieces of evidence and then through logos appeals saying, here's how all of these pieces fit together. If we believe this and we know this to be true, then it necessarily follows that this particular thing must be true. It's things that you do a lot, but now we're just thinking about them in a more scholarly and intentional capacity. All right, let's move on to the next thing. As I was mentioning when I was talking about ethos, counter-arguments are really central to building a strong argument. In order to present yourself as credible and well-versed on the subject, you've got to be able to anticipate people's potential criticisms or rebuttals to your argument. So it does a lot in terms of adding credibility, strengthening evidence, all things that you really need in terms of argument. Let's think back to my original claim, which is me saying that Hannah Atisha is intentionally paralleling or talking about her life in Iraq with life in America and specifically the flood water crisis in order to think about ways that government corruption can often be hidden from us based on the expectations of the type of political system that is in that country. That sounded really complicated the way I said it. See, it's all a drafting process. Probably by the end of this video, I'll be able to figure out how to say it a little bit more concisely. So I'm going to look at a particular passage that's from later in the book. I think it's from like maybe the third or fourth to last chapter, but it is a moment in the book where I think Hannah Atisha's writing might provide a potential rebuttal to my central claim. So I'm just going to read that for you now, put that up on the screen. So on page 324, she says, "My family came to the United States basically fleeing oppression in search of a peaceful and prosperous place for my brother and me to grow up. The American dream worked for us." So this on its surface looks like it's kind of going against my argument. She seems to be saying, actually, America and Iraq are very different. And she is saying that. She's saying that there was an American dream and that it worked for her and her family in terms of her dad getting a job at GM and his work being well supported and them having amenities and access to things like healthcare that were often in jeopardy whenever their parents lived in Iraq. However, as she continues, I think it offers her own rebuttal to her own point. So let me just read that for you now and I'll put that on the screen. But there really are two Americas, aren't there? The America I was lucky to grow up in and the other America, the one I see in my clinic every day. We've got a really complex moment here. She's saying, yes, the America she knew was better. It gave her a bright future, it helped her to become a doctor, and she became very connected to her community. However, there are two sides, and now as a doctor, she's able to see this other side, especially in the Flint water crisis. So how I would use this particular quote to address a potential counter-argument and then strengthen my own argument is that I would write something a little bit like this, and I'll put this up on the screen for you as well. Immediately after introducing this quote, I would write, "This quote on its surface makes Hannah Atisha's life in America seem perfect, and she says the American dream, quote, worked for her family. Hannah Atisha does seem to argue that her family's life in America is better than her family's life under Saddam Hussein. However, her claim that there are, quote, two Americas demonstrates Hannah Atisha's continued emphasis on what lies beneath the surface, including government corruption in a political system that is supposed to be for the people. Even though the actions of the Michigan government officials were not as horrifying as the descriptions of Hussein's regime that Hannah Atisha shares with us, Hannah Atisha is showing us how faith in systems like democracy can blind us to the corruption below the surface." So now I've got a solid 5 or 6 sentences, an entire good meaty paragraph centered around just this one quote. I've identified a potential counter-argument. For example, the fact that someone might say, well, Hannah Atisha says a lot that America worked for her family. Obviously, she thinks it's much better. And I'm not saying that she doesn't. I am saying that she's saying that there are two Americas, and that, again, thinking about the title, What the Eyes Don't See, just because we're in one position oftentimes means that we don't have access or the viewpoint of a differing position that might help us learn a little bit more about the topic. Now, I've demonstrated that not only I've definitely read this book, start to finish, got a diverse quote from the end to hopefully bolster some of the stuff that I'd be talking about from the introduction earlier in my paper, but I also established myself as someone who's credible and who's really thought about how many different ways there are to interpret this text and what we can take away from it. And so, of course, that brings us to our final thing, that we need to bring it all together in the conclusion. Conclusions are an important piece of any writing, speech, movie, etc., but they're particularly important in argument. You've probably heard from teachers before that your conclusion restates and summarizes what you've already said. That's not entirely true, though it is partially true. Your conclusion, especially in an argumentative essay, is where you say, now look, I showed you a bunch of different evidence. I showed you, for example, maybe you're talking about foreshadowing. Maybe you're talking about the abundant use of metaphor. Maybe you're talking about pathos and ethos appeals, very different things. But you're saying, even though these things are different, this is how they all work together to demonstrate X message, to give us X meaning. So your conclusion is really important because it's where you get your final opportunity to piece everything together for your reader and make your argument the strongest it can possibly be. So like with the introduction, the conclusion is something that you're going to be working on over time. It's not going to be perfect in the first draft or the second draft, but as you also begin to understand your writing and your argument more, return to that conclusion, return to that introduction. Think about how your new understanding can help you make things clearer and more concise for your audience. And that's really all I have today. As always, if you have any questions about any of your papers, any of your projects, you can always email me. I'm happy to meet with you, and I hope that you'll have a great week and are really excited to get arguing.